Hi everyone, it's Philip here on the 1st of April, and that would mean we're about a week into COVID-19 lockdown with at least another 3 weeks to look forward to. And I wonder whether you are looking forward to them at all. How has it been for you at home? Would you mind sharing some of your stories perhaps, what you're up to, what you've been doing this last week, and perhaps some plans for the next few? You can pop them in the comments section below and others could see it as well, and we could just sort of share stories. What we've been doing here at the Renner household probably wouldn't surprise you. The jigsaw puzzles, board games, movies, Netflix shows, a bit of baking, not that there's much flour to be had these days, guitar playing, computer gaming, and a bit of art. The girls have been into their art as well. So we've done a range of things, and of course I've spent a bit of time on these vlogs, probably a little bit too much actually. I can't seem to get them right. Anyway. What are you doing? What are you up to? If you've got a photo you could share with us, that would be quite cool as well. Let us enter into your environment a little with a picture. I would have loved to have seen one from the Brewertons. Greg was sharing with me the other day the story. Nate, the youngest, had decided to make some signs for the house. Out of the goodness of his heart, he thought that they needed some help orienting themselves at home. So he had signs made up, ones for the bookcase and for the table and for the bench, things like that. And stuck them all up with glue. You know, you don't want to lose them. And fortunately, it was glue stick and was easily removed. But that would have been a good photo, I would have thought. So maybe you got those sorts of things that you could share with us. Post them on Facebook, and it'll be great, I think, to help connect that way. Speaking of signs, Nate, if you wouldn't mind making one for me for this next part of Revelation 4. From here on in, things are going to get pretty wild, and I would love a sign. If you could make one and maybe post it to Facebook, as it would say, enter here at your own risk, here be dragons, because from this point on, things get wild. Revelation 4 opens the door to some pretty crazy stuff. And so we need to go into this with a bit of humility and with our boots strapped on properly and tread with care, I think. And just a point to format here, I'm not going to be reading the text. So what you do is you hit pause if you want to refresh what it says in the Bible, and read that for yourself. Go and get yourself a cup of tea or coffee, and then come back and we'll resume together. But I have done a lot of study, and I will avoid Revelation by Craig Kerster, very good book. I'll avoid the text by text exegetical process here. I think that it can get a little bit. We can get a little lost in the weeds if we approach this big picture book in that way. The details help draw us into big picture realities, and when we reduce it to the details, we tend to lose sight of the big picture. So I'll try and keep it all into the big picture realm, and we'll see how we go. Right, Revelation 4. I've got my sign from Nate. Thanks very much, buddy. A wild scene of worship. And this is how we start the judgment of God on the world, with a worship scene. And very appropriate that we do so. And it's an incredible scene, isn't it? It's worship that I've never experienced, certainly here on earth, and don't imagine to experience until we enter the heavenly realms. But John does his very best to help us enter into this throne room of heaven with him, with some pretty great language, visual, visceral language of colours and of lightning and thunder and flaring torches, of a sea of glass, of a throne on which a being is seated, and around whom these strange creatures are hovering, and 24 elders around that, seated on their thrones. And these creatures and elders are crying out worship to the one seated on the throne. And I can imagine it would only have been incredibly loud, incredibly confronting, and just epic as far as a worship set is concerned. And that's how we start. That's how we enter this big book of apocalyptic literature. Just setting aside the letters, if you like. Not that we need to set the letters aside, but you know what I mean. We're starting a new scene and a new journey here. Epic worship is how John wants us to start. Epic worship. And why would you do that? Why is that the place to start when it comes to the judgment of God on the problems of the world? Well, here's one way to think about this. What was it like for you when an authority figure in your life tapped you on the shoulder one day and said, "It's time that we had a meeting, I've got some things to share with you"? Could have been a boss, could have been a teacher or a principal of the school. It could have been a parent or grandparent, someone in authority in your life. And how do you feel? Did you feel happy about that? My instinct actually, and maybe it wasn't yours, but my instinct was, oh no, what have I done? What have I forgotten to do? Where have I failed? Or, oh no, they've discovered what I did do. I had plenty of reasons I felt to be afraid of that conversation. Now imagine that that person had said, there's a matter of judgment I want to bring before you, and we need to have a conversation. I think that my anxiety would just crank up to the next level. So this book, being about the judgment of God, no surprise that people come to it with a bit of fear and trepidation, because we're used to that. That's our common experience here on earth. And yet what we find, the opening scene as we come to this judgment on earth stuff, is a scene of worship in which all created beings and all of God's people come before God in joy and in wonder, thanking Him for His goodness, thanking Him for creating us, thanking Him for being a good creator. It's not a scene of fear at all. Yes, trembling, awe, but not fear. There's no sense in this worship scene that we need to be worried about what God is going to say about us or to us on the subject of judgment. We're invited to come before God to worship and thank Him as judgment begins. And that's different, isn't it, from how we typically think of the subject of judgment or even the matter of God and judgment. And that point is brought to its greatest realization when we see how John is so carefully describing the scene of the throne and the throne room, and yet leaving the one on the throne without description at all. It's almost as if John is saying, the one seated on the throne is so far above us, you cannot comprehend him. And in fact, one of our problems probably is that when it comes to the matter of God and judgment, we tend to impose upon God earthly expectations. And rather, we need to let God bring to us His heavenly understanding, His divine sovereign opinion on what judgment is going to look like. And He's inviting us into a mystery of God by deliberately not describing God, by leaving the focal point of this chapter actually as an empty mystery. Not entirely empty. There's some three elements worth describing or picking up. One is He is one, seated on the throne, therefore there's not many gods. That He is on a throne, therefore that's a sign of authority and sovereign rule. And seated, therefore, ready to do business, but in no great panic, not in a stew, not pacing around the floor of the throne room as if He's worried about what's about to happen and about to happen next. And you can imagine that there might be good reason to do so, because all hell seems to break loose once this scene's over. And yet He's seated on the throne, completely in control. And around Him, the creatures of the earth and the people of God bring their praise of worship. Is that what you imagine God is like? Patient, totally in control, not worried? Do you imagine that's how it will feel on Judgment Day? That God is at rest in His work? And do you imagine that when you come before God on Judgment Day, that you will have reason to thank God and to be grateful to God? Or do you imagine you'll have reason to feel shame? Do you imagine yourself worried about punishment? These are the things that, as we enter the judgment of God, we need to reflect on carefully, because as the commentators have said, particularly on this question of why is John so carefully not picturing God? Why is he leaving a gap here? Well, it's because of the weighty subject that we're about to deal with, and the likelihood that we will draw and impose upon God the same kind of despotic, tyrannical kind of rule that we're familiar with here on earth. That as soon as someone gets ultimate power, they use it to better themselves and improve their position. They use it to defeat their enemies in order to secure their position. That we use power to dominate people and to crush and subdue people. And if we think that God is like that, if we come to the judgment of God thinking those thoughts, then we have missed who God really is. And in fact, we need to resist the temptation of imagining God too closely, because even though we are made in God's image, it's not that we are to return the favor and make him in our image. And so John is doing something very clear and deliberate and important here, that when it comes to the judgment of God, it is a good thing. When it comes to the judgment of God, we should celebrate and not do this kind of hand-wringing, gleeful kind of thing of, I can't wait until the evil people get their just desserts. I think that's how we would normally, that's a human and earthly way of thinking about bringing judgment. It is just crushing our enemies. And yet God has, I believe, a way of doing things that is going to surprise and beg a belief. I have this conviction, this kind of heart and gut feel that just as the Messiah, though predicted throughout Israel's history to come and save Israel, was so utterly unlike their expectations when Jesus actually came, and they still can't get their head around the fact that the Messiah would come and die on a cross. I get the feeling that that's exactly how God also will make us feel when he wraps up the judgment of all the earth. That we will feel not a sense of horror and at how much destruction has been poured out, but rather one of utter joy and wonder that I can't imagine how you did that. And yet here it is. Everything is renewed. Everything is restored. There's no laws needed. There's no enforcement needed. No one needs to be beaten down. God, you are not just another tyrant. You're not just another despot who uses power to destroy and to subjugate. So our imagination is limited and captivated by some fairly, dare I say it, satanic ways of thinking about the use of force. Ways that are so utterly different to the use of God's power that is evident on the cross. Right? That's where we need to keep coming back to. God has displayed his judgment on the earth already through the cross of Christ. And the judgment was, I'm going to judge the evil forces that hold all of creation in captivity. I'm going to judge and shame them. And the cross has done that. And I am going to allow life to swallow death. It's such a strange image, but we see that happening in the resurrection of Christ, who goes through death and comes out the other side with an eternal body, living in an eternal realm. I can't imagine how it's going to happen. In the same way that even though I have images of God in my head and in my heart, they all fall far short of who he truly is. That I cannot create God in my image. And I have to leave this important, essential mystery at the heart of when I use that word God. I have to hold it in humility and say, even though I know some things and think I know some things, nevertheless, thank God he is so far above me. He can do some things that I cannot do. He can use power in a way I cannot imagine power being used. Power perhaps to lay down power and bring us into love through mercy, through graciousness, through forgiveness. The sort of power that I imagine being weak. He can do it. And for me, that leads me to worship. It leads me back to Revelation, scene 4, chapter 4, where I find that the mystery of God, the otherness and utterly holiness means otherness, the utter holiness of God inspires in me joy and wonder and hope, because I truly believe he can bring all things together for good. He can make all things work together for good without having to do more evil. He is so far above that. He has no limits, and he will bring goodness and justice and lead us to worship. So those are my reflections, and I wonder if I can invite you to offer your own. Particularly, how do you see God? John's been very careful not to describe him, but we obviously have images that come to mind. How do you see this ineffable God, this God of mystery who cannot really be described? What words would you use to describe him? And in thinking about it, are you happy with those words? Do you think that they really do line up with a God that you would want to come running to and throw yourself in gladness at his feet? Is that the God that comes to your mind, or is it a God that instills in you fear that perhaps needs to be redeemed? That image, maybe restore in us a heart of mystery, a mystery where God can dwell and be fully God in our lives and in our imaginations, so that we can allow God to be fully able to do whatever he wants to do in us and with us. So yeah, if you'd like to add in your thoughts, how you see God, whether you think it's a good image, how you got that image, it'd be great to share, and we can pick that up as a comment and discussion thread. So thanks for listening, and I hope that you're doing well. And again, please share with us what's going on in your lives. I'm sure many of us would be very interested to know. So God bless. Thank you for tuning in. It wouldn't have been the same without you. Catch you soon.